So now that we picked up those important React basics, it's time to dig a bit deeper to dive into some advanced concepts like routing, sending HTTP requests, and application-wide state management, and what all these things are. We're going to explore that. And for this, we're going to leave this basic project, this basic demo we worked on. Instead, we're going to build this meetup demo application I showed you earlier already. And for that, I cleaned up my project. I removed basically all the imports and all the content from this app file here. And index.css has some new content. You find my updated project attached. So there you also find the updated index.css file. And I deleted all the components. Now, as I just said, you find this updated starting state attached, and you can therefore then start with that same project. In the end here, once you downloaded it, you need to run npm install again. Then once that's done, you can npm start this project again to bring up that development server again. And that will give you a blank page. Because now we're going to build this project from the ground up, and this project will now involve more components than the previous one, and it will involve the important concept of routing. Now, what does routing mean? Consider this Netflix example from before again. There I went to the My List page to view the items I added to my list. Now, it looks like I visited a totally different page, but if you watch this refresh icon in the top left corner, you see that it never changes. It never goes into that loading mode. Because actually, we never fetched a new HTML page. The page loaded by the browser never changed. We always stay on that single page. And that's the case for Netflix, because they also have such a single page application. It should also be the case for our project now. I want to give the user the illusion of having different pages to which we can navigate, whilst actually staying on one and the same page and leaving it up to React to change what's visible on the page. The advantage of this approach is that we never have to wait for a new page to be loaded. Instead, we can always stay fast, stay reactive, because everything is handled by client-side JavaScript, which is faster than sending a new request to a server. And that can really enhance the user experience. Now, therefore, we want to add something which is called routing to our project. We want to add a router. A special tool which actually watches changes in the URL and then changes what's visible on the screen based on the URL. So which basically gives us a way of giving our users this illusion of routing. And for this, I'll actually quit this development server again and install a new dependency, a new third-party package into this project. We do this with npm install, with the npm install command, but now not just executed like this, but instead we now add a package name thereafter. The name of the package which should be installed, so downloaded, into this project here. And that's the react-router-dom package. That's a package which, as the name kind of implies, allows us to add routing functionality to React. So it allows us to handle URLs and change what's visible on the screen without fetching new HTML pages. Simply hit enter and this package will be installed. And in package.json, you'll see that a new entry was added. So that file was automatically updated, which means that if you now share this project again without a Node modules folder and someone then runs just npm install again, that newly added package will also be picked up and installed because it is part of this package.json file. Now we don't need to do this here because we just did install it. So we can run npm start again to bring up that development server again. And now we can add routing. But what does this mean? What does add routing mean? In the end, it means that we need to add this routing tool to our code so that we have this thing watching for URL changes, and we need to let this thing, this tool, know which component should be loaded as a page for which route, for which URL. And for this, I'll start by adding a new folder next to the components folder inside the src folder, and that's the pages folder. You don't have to add this folder and you don't have to name it pages, but in the end here, this is a good way of differentiating and of separating our components that are embedded in other components, which will be stored in the components folder, from the components that will be loaded as pages. Technically, we'll build components in the same way, no matter how we use them. But for us as a developer, to have an easier time to quickly find the right component we want to work on, I'll separate them into these two folders. And in the pages folder, we're now going to add a couple of React components, which again will be built just like all the other components, but which will be loaded by this router we just installed when certain URLs are visited. And here for this application, for this project we're building here, I'll add a all meetups.js file, so a component that will be responsible for loading and displaying all the meetups we have. I'll add a new meetup.js file, and I'll add a favorites.js file. New meetup will allow us to add a new meetup later, and favorites.js will allow us to view our favorited meetups, because we'll add a functionality that allows us to bookmark, to favorite a meetup as a user. But step by step, for the moment, I'll just set up some dummy components in these three files. And I'll start with all meetups, and I'll name this component function all meetups page. You can name it however you want. I'll just choose this name to make it clear that this component will be used as a page that's loaded by this router. Now, just as all the other components we built before, this component has to be exported, and it needs to return some JSX code. And for the moment, I'll just return a div where I say all meetups page. That's of course not the final content, but some starting content for now. Then we can copy this and add it in the favorites file here. So this is the favorites page, and we want to export the favorites page. And here I'll then say favorites page, and then save this and copy this into new meetup and name this new meetup page, and also use that name for exporting, and here we say new meetup page. Now we got these three page components. Now we need to use that router package to define when which page should be loaded. And for this, we first of all need to go to index.js and wrap our app component, which we render here, with another component. For this, we need to import something from react-router-dom, and that something which we import is the browser router, like this. Now it turns out that browser router is in the end a component itself, and therefore we can use it as a HTML element, opening and closing tags, and wrap those tags around the app component. Now, that is something we haven't seen up to this point, that a non-standard component, so a non-HTML component, would be wrapped around something, but it is something we can do, and it is something we are doing here. We're going to learn how we make our own components wrappable a little bit later in this course. So now we initialize this router package. We make it aware of this app, and we ensure that it watches our URL, so to say. Now, as a next step, we need to define the URLs we want to support and which pages should be loaded for the different URLs. And we do this in the app component now, so in this wrapped component. In there, we return a div, and we can leave it like this. But now in this div, I want to return or use other components which are also imported from React Router DOM. So we also import React Router DOM here, and here we import the route component. So just like browser router, route is a component and we use it like a component, but the job of the route component is to define different paths in the URL we want to listen to and which component should be loaded for these different paths. And therefore, I will also already import my free page components here, the all meetups page from /pages all meetups, and then the new meetup page from .pages new meetup, and of course also the favorites page component from /pages favorites. And now in this div here, we can use the route component, which I'm importing from React Router DOM, and give it a path prop, a path attribute. Now path takes a string, and that will be the path in the URL after your domain. So in our case, our domain is, for example, localhost 3000. That's our domain. Of course, on a real server after deployment, that would be something like mypage.com. And now the part after the domain is the path. That can be just a slash, so no path at all in the end, or it can be something like /favorites or /products or anything like that. So the part after the domain is the path, and here we define for which path which component should be loaded. And here we can start with /nothing to handle the default path that we just visited our domain /nothing. And then between these route tags, we actually do now add the component that should be loaded, like the all meetups page like this. Because that should be the starting page actually. We can add another route here for, let's say, /new-meetup. And the path is up to you. If we now visit mydomain.com/new-meetup, then the component which we render between these route tags will be loaded. And that could be the new meetups page. And last but not least, we can also define a route for the path /favorites and then render the favorites page like this. Now we're defining 3 routes, and instead of this content here, the actual page component will be rendered if that route determines that the current URL matches this path. So if we are on mydomain.com/new-meetup, this new meetup page component would be rendered and not the favorites page, for example. So if we save this and we go back and reload localhost 3000, we should see the all meetups page here. But if we go to favorites, for example, we see favorites page as well. But wait a second, is this the desired result, that we see it as well? Well, it depends. In some applications, depending on what you build, you might want such a nested page so that the page for just /nothing is rendered, but also this specific page for /favorites. We see this output because by default, React Router matches all your paths, and it simply checks if the current path includes these paths here. And /favorites includes both /favorites as well as just /, which is why both components are rendered. Again, that could be what you want, but often it's not. That's why there is another component provided by React Router DOM which helps us, and that's the switch component. We can use the switch component to wrap all our route components like this, and with that we tell React Router that only one of these routes should be active, so at most one of these pages should be rendered. If we do that and save this, we don't see 2 components being rendered, but we don't see the correct component being rendered either. Instead, for /favorites, we now see all meetups. And the reason for this is now how your routes are matched. React Router by default checks if the path of the current URL starts with the paths defined here. And because of switch, it will then stop looking at the other routes as soon as it has a hit, as soon as it finds a match. Now, of course, /favorites starts with just slash, and then because of switch, it doesn't look any further, and therefore all meetups is rendered. That's not what we want, and we can prevent this by adding the exact prop here on route and setting this to true. Though you can also shorten this, and if you have a prop which you just want to set to a truthy value, you can just add the prop name like this. So we add the exact prop and set it to true to this first route. And the exact prop tells React Router that for this route, it should not check if the path begins with this path, but if the full path matches this path. And that's now, of course, not the case for /favorites. So this will not create a match, and it will continue looking, and it will ultimately find this route for /favorites. So now we see the favorites page. For new-meetup, we see the new meetup page. And for just localhost 3000, we see the all meetups page. And that's how we can add routing. But of course, at the moment, we're just navigating around by entering URLs manually. And that's not very realistic. In reality, we would probably want some header, some navigation bar at the top which provides different links. And therefore, that is what we're going to add next.